You think you know what desperation looks like until you've watched a man die for the crime of being too tired to pick cotton fast enough. Stay with me, because what happens next will challenge everything you believe about survival, compassion, and the bonds that form when humanity hangs by a thread. The whip cracked against Samuel's back for the 37th time. Elijah Carter had stopped counting after 20, but his mind kept the tally anyway, a cruel mathematics of suffering that would haunt him long after Samuel's body went still in the red Texas dirt. Master Whitmore stood over the corpse, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill that swept across the Brazos River bottomland. His breathing was labored, not from exertion, but from the intoxication of absolute power. The other field hands stood frozen in their rows, cotton bowls clutched in trembling fists, eyes fixed on anything but the broken form of their friend. "Let this be a lesson," Whitmore wheezed, coiling the bloodied leather. "Productivity ain't a suggestion on my land. It's a commandment." Elijah's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. 28 years of bondage had taught him to swallow rage like bitter medicine, but watching Samuel, gentle Samuel who shared his cornbread and sang hymns while they worked, beaten to death over a day's quota, had shattered something fundamental inside him. The overseer, Jenkins, spat tobacco juice near Samuel's outstretched hand. "Y'all get back to work. Cotton don't pick itself, and we got quotas to meet before the annexation paperwork goes through. Texas gonna be official American territory soon, and that means more buyers, more money, more expectations." As the others shuffled back to their rows, Elijah knelt beside Samuel's body. The man's eyes stared sightlessly at the gray October sky, and Elijah gently closed them with fingers that shook despite his efforts at control. "Move along, boy," Jenkins barked, but there was less venom in it than usual. Even the overseer seemed unsettled by the morning's brutality. That night, in the cramped quarters that housed 40 souls in a space meant for 20, Elijah lay on his straw pallet and listened to the whispered prayers and muffled sobs of his fellow captives. The walls seemed to press closer with each passing hour, thick with the weight of collective grief and helpless fury. Old Moses, the eldest among them at 63, sat in the corner mending a torn shirt by candlelight. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had witnessed too many Samuels over the decades. "You got that look," Moses whispered without glancing up from his needlework. "What look?" Elijah kept his voice low, aware that even here walls had ears. "Same look my daddy had the night before he tried to run. Same look I had when I was your age and thought I could outrun the dogs." Moses tied off a stitch with deliberate care. "It's the look of a man who's decided he'd rather die free than live in chains." Elijah said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "You thinking about Samuel," Moses continued. "Thinking about how it could have been you under that whip. Thinking about how it will be you sooner or later, because men like Whitmore don't stop until they break every spirit in their possession." Through the single window, Elijah could see the main house glowing with warm lamplight. Whitmore and his family would be sitting down to dinner. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, maybe apple pie. They would say grace and thank God for their blessings, while Samuel's body lay wrapped in burlap in the tool shed, waiting for the morning burial detail. "The Brazos runs north," Moses said, his voice barely audible. "Follow it upstream, stay in the shallows where the dogs can't track. But know this, that river runs through Comanche territory. They say those warriors can track a whisper through stone and kill a man with their bare hands. Better to die fighting than to die picking cotton for another man's profit," Elijah replied. Moses finally looked up, his ancient eyes reflecting the candlelight like chips of obsidian. "Maybe so, but dying ain't the only way to be free. Sometimes living is the harder choice and the braver one." Outside, a nightbird called across the cotton fields, a lonesome sound that seemed to carry all the sorrow of the enslaved. Elijah closed his eyes and tried to picture Samuel's face before the beating, tried to remember his laugh and the way he hummed while he worked. But all he could see was the moment when the light left his friend's eyes, and all he could hear was the wet sound of leather against flesh. The decision crystallized in his chest like ice forming on still water. He would not die in these fields. He would not let Whitmore's whip write the final chapter of his story. Whatever lay beyond the Brazos, Comanche warriors, wild animals, starvation, or worse, it had to be better than this slow death of the spirit. As the others settled into uneasy sleep, Elijah began to plan. He knew the patrol schedules, knew which dogs were used for tracking, knew the terrain between the quarters and the river. He had one advantage that most runaways lacked. He could read, a skill taught to him in secret by the previous master's daughter before she died of fever. Maps, if he could find them, would be his salvation. The candle guttered and died, plunging the quarters into darkness. But in that darkness, Elijah Carter began to see the first glimmer of a different future, one written in his own hand, paid for with his own blood, and earned through his own courage. Tomorrow night, when the moon was dark and the guards were drowsy with whiskey, he would test whether freedom was worth dying for. And somewhere in the distance, the Brazos River whispered its ancient promise to carry him toward whatever destiny awaited beyond the cotton fields of bondage. The moment Elijah's feet touched the cold water of the Brazos, he knew there was no turning back. But what he didn't know was that his first night of freedom would nearly be his last. Keep watching, because the river that promised salvation is about to become his greatest enemy. The river ran black under the moonless sky, its current stronger than Elijah had anticipated. He waded upstream, staying close to the eastern bank, where overhanging willows provided cover from any patrol that might venture this far from the plantation. The water reached his waist, and the October chill cut through his thin cotton shirt like a blade. Behind him, Fort Bend County slept under a blanket of false peace. Ahead lay the disputed territory where Texas Rangers, Comanche war parties, and Mexican forces played a deadly game of territorial chess. Elijah had chosen the most dangerous route possible, but it was also the least expected. No sane runaway would head into Comanche lands. His bare feet found purchase on the rocky riverbed, but each step sent shooting pains up his legs. 3 days of reduced rations, Whitmore's punishment for the entire quarters after Samuel's death, had left him weakened. The small bundle of stolen cornbread and dried meat tied to his waist represented his only sustenance, and he knew it wouldn't last more than 2 days if he was careful. The first hour passed without incident. Elijah fell into a rhythm. Step, listen, step, listen. Every sound, the splash of a beaver, the rustle of wind through cattails, the distant howl of a coyote sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. But gradually, the immediate terror of pursuit gave way to a different kind of fear, the vast uncertainty of what lay ahead. By dawn, he had covered perhaps 5 miles. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and his lips were already cracked from dehydration despite being surrounded by water. The river water looked clean enough, but old Moses had warned him about the fever that came from drinking untreated stream water. Still, as the sun climbed higher and his thirst became unbearable, he cupped his hands and drank deeply. The taste was earthy, tinged with minerals and the faint sweetness of decomposing vegetation. It was the taste of freedom, and despite the risk, it was the most satisfying water he had ever consumed. As the morning progressed, Elijah began to notice changes in the landscape. The cultivated fields gave way to wild prairie grass that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean. Mesquite trees dotted the terrain, their thorny branches offering both shelter and hazard. In the distance, he could see the dark line of a forest that marked the beginning of true wilderness. It was there, as he approached a bend in the river where the current had carved deep pools into the bank, that Elijah encountered his first real danger. The ground beneath his feet suddenly gave way, and he found himself sinking into what appeared to be solid earth, but was actually a treacherous mixture of sand and water, quicksand, the river's hidden trap for the unwary. Panic seized him as he felt the sandy mixture pull at his legs with surprising strength. He had heard stories of quicksand from other field hands, tales of men and animals swallowed whole by the hungry earth. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank, the sand now reaching his thighs. Fighting every instinct to thrash and fight, Elijah forced himself to remain still. He remembered something Samuel had once told him about a mule that had been saved from quicksand by lying flat and distributing its weight. Slowly, carefully, Elijah leaned backward until he was nearly horizontal, his arms spread wide. The sinking stopped. For several terrifying minutes he lay motionless, feeling the sand's grip gradually loosen as he spread his weight across a larger surface. Then, inch by agonizing inch, he began to work his way towards solid ground, using a swimming motion that kept his weight distributed. When he finally pulled himself free, his entire body was coated in gray sand that clung to his wet clothes like a second skin. He lay gasping on the riverbank, his heart hammering against his ribs. The quicksand had claimed one of his shoes, and his bundle of food had been soaked, but he was alive. As he wrung out his clothes and tried to salvage what he could of his provisions, Elijah realized that the wilderness was going to test him in ways he had never imagined. The plantation had been a prison, but it had also been predictable. Out here, every step could be his last, every decision a matter of life and death. The sun was approaching its zenith when he heard the sound that made his blood freeze. The distant baying of hounds. The dogs had found his trail, and they were closing fast. Whitmore must have discovered his absence at the morning roll call and immediately set the trackers loose. Elijah plunged back into the river, hoping the water would mask his scent, but he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The dogs would work both banks, and eventually they would pick up his trail again. He needed to find a way to throw them off permanently, or his brief taste of freedom would end with the crack of a whip, or worse. As he waded upstream with renewed urgency, the landscape around him began to change again. The prairie grass grew taller, and strange rock formations jutted from the earth like the bones of ancient giants. This was the edge of Comanche territory, a land where few white men ventured and fewer still returned. The baying grew closer, and Elijah could now hear the shouts of men, at least 3 voices, maybe 4. They were following the river, just as Moses had predicted they would. But they were also making noise, crashing through the underbrush with the confidence of men who believed their quarry was helpless. That confidence, Elijah realized, might be their weakness. He began to look for opportunities. A fallen tree that might serve as a bridge to the opposite bank, a tributary that might confuse the trail, anything that could give him an advantage over his pursuers. It was then that he saw the smoke. A thin column of gray smoke rose from beyond a ridge, perhaps half a mile to the west. It was too small to be a settlement, too controlled to be a wildfire. Someone was camping in the wilderness, and that someone might be his salvation or his doom. The baying of the hounds grew louder, and Elijah knew he was running out of time. Whatever lay beyond that ridge, it had to be better than the certain death that pursued him. He left the river and began to climb toward the smoke, his wet clothes clinging to his body and his shoeless foot leaving bloody prints on the rocky ground. Behind him, the dogs had reached the spot where he had escaped the quicksand. Their excited barking told him they had found his scent again. The hunt was entering its final phase, and Elijah Carter was about to discover whether the wilderness held friends or enemies. What Elijah discovered beyond that ridge would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, because sometimes the person who needs saving isn't who you'd expect. Stay with me, because this moment of choice will echo through both their lives forever. The smoke led Elijah to a sight that stopped him cold. A young Comanche boy, no more than 11 or 12, was trapped waist-deep in another patch of quicksand near a small creek that fed into the Brazos. The child's dark eyes were wide with terror, but he wasn't crying. His jaw was set with the stoic determination Elijah had heard was characteristic of Comanche warriors, even the youngest ones. The boy's horse, a painted pony with distinctive white and brown markings, stood nearby, its reins trailing in the mud. A small fire smoldered a few yards away, explaining the smoke Elijah had seen. This was clearly a temporary camp, probably a hunting or scouting expedition that had gone wrong. For a moment, Elijah stood frozen behind a cluster of mesquite trees, his mind racing through the implications. Every story he had ever heard about the Comanche painted them as ruthless killers who showed no mercy to trespassers in their territory. This boy, despite his youth, was a member of the most feared warrior nation on the frontier. But as Elijah watched, the child sank another inch into the hungry sand, and something deeper than fear or prejudice stirred in his chest. He saw not a Comanche warrior, but a terrified child facing the same death that had nearly claimed him just hours earlier. The baying of the hounds was getting closer, perhaps 10 minutes behind him now. Every second he delayed brought his pursuers nearer, but Elijah found himself stepping out from behind the trees. The boy's head snapped toward him, and for an instant, their eyes met across the small clearing. The child's hand moved instinctively toward a knife at his belt, but the quicksand held him too firmly for any aggressive action. Instead, he spoke in rapid Comanche, his voice high and urgent. Elijah didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a plea for help that transcended language barriers. The boy was asking him to save his life. "Easy," Elijah said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy, boy. I'm going to help you." He looked around quickly, assessing the situation. A fallen branch lay near the fire, long enough and sturdy enough to serve as a lever. Moving carefully to avoid the treacherous ground, Elijah retrieved the branch and approached the edge of the quicksand. The boy watched his every movement with intelligent eyes, and when Elijah extended the branch toward him, he immediately understood. Small hands, surprisingly strong, gripped the wood with desperate intensity. "Hold tight," Elijah murmured, though he knew the child couldn't understand his words. "I'm going to pull you out, but you have to stay calm. Don't fight the sand." Using the same technique that had saved his own life, Elijah helped the boy lean back and distribute his weight while gradually working him free from the sand's grip. It was slow, careful work, made more urgent by the approaching sound of the hunting party. When the boy finally pulled free, he collapsed on solid ground, gasping and covered in the same gray sand that still clung to Elijah's clothes. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two human beings who had shared a moment of mortal danger and emerged alive. The child was small for his age, with the lean build of someone accustomed to life in the saddle. His hair was black and straight, braided with small feathers and beads that marked his tribal affiliation. Despite his youth, there was something ancient in his eyes, a gravity that spoke of a culture that demanded maturity from its children. Elijah heard the dogs again, much closer now, and knew he had to move. But as he turned to go, the boy spoke, this time in broken English. "You saved Tuhuya," the child said, struggling with the unfamiliar sounds. "Why?" The question hit Elijah like a physical blow. Why had he risked everything to save a Comanche child? Why had he thrown away precious minutes of his lead to help someone who, by all accounts, should have been his enemy? "Because you needed help," Elijah said simply, "and because leaving you to die would have made me no better than the men who killed my friend." The boy, Tuhuya, tilted his head, processing this answer. Then he reached into a leather pouch at his waist and pulled out a piece of dried meat, offering it to Elijah with solemn ceremony. Elijah's stomach cramped with hunger, but he shook his head. "You keep it. You need your strength." Tuhuya's eyes widened at this refusal. In his culture, refusing a gift was often seen as an insult, but something in Elijah's manner seemed to convey respect rather than rejection. The boy nodded slowly and tucked the meat away. The sound of crashing brush came from just beyond the ridge. The hunting party had reached the creek, and it would be only moments before they spotted the smoke from the fire. "I have to go," Elijah said, backing toward the trees. "Thank you for the offer of food. Maybe we'll meet again under better circumstances." But as he turned to flee, Tuhuya called out in English again, "Elijah!" Elijah spun around, shocked. He had never told the boy his name. Tuhuya pointed to his own chest. "Tuhuya, remember! Tuhuya, remember Elijah who saved life!" Then he pointed toward the northwest, where the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "3 sons, Tuhuya find you." Before Elijah could ask what he meant, the boy had swung onto his pony with fluid grace and was galloping away, leaving only hoofprints in the mud and the dying embers of his fire. Elijah had no time to ponder the encounter. The first hound appeared at the top of the ridge, its nose to the ground and its tail wagging with the excitement of a fresh scent. Behind it came the voices of men, closer than ever. He plunged back into the wilderness, his mind reeling from what had just occurred. He had saved a Comanche child's life, and somehow that child had known his name. More puzzling still was the boy's promise, or was it a threat, to find him in 3 days. As Elijah ran through the tall grass, dodging mesquite thorns and prairie dog holes, he couldn't shake the image of Tuhuya's solemn face or the weight of the moment when their eyes had met across the quicksand. In that instant, all the barriers of race and culture had fallen away, leaving only 2 human beings connected by the most basic of bonds, the instinct to preserve life. Whether that bond would prove to be his salvation or his doom remained to be seen. But as the baying of the hounds faded behind him and the vast Texas wilderness opened before him, Elijah Carter carried with him the knowledge that he had chosen compassion over survival, and somehow that choice felt like the first truly free decision of his life. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of storms to come and the echo of a young voice speaking his name with something that might have been respect. 3 days of hunger and hiding had pushed Elijah to the edge of death when the sound of hoofbeats changed everything. But what rode out of the morning mist would either save his life or end it in ways he never imagined. Don't look away, because this moment will rewrite the rules of survival itself. Elijah lay curled beneath a fallen cottonwood tree, his body racked with fever and his lips cracked from dehydration. The past 3 days had been a nightmare of near misses with patrol parties, failed attempts to catch fish with his bare hands, and the constant gnawing of hunger that had reduced him to eating grass and tree bark. His escape from the hunting party at Tuhuya's camp had been successful, but the cost had been severe. In his desperate flight, he had lost his remaining food to a creek crossing and torn his feet bloody on the rocky terrain. Now, as dawn broke over the endless prairie, he wasn't sure he had the strength to continue. The fever had started the previous evening, probably from the infected cuts on his feet or the questionable water he had been forced to drink from stagnant pools. His vision swam in and out of focus, and he found himself drifting between consciousness and delirium, sometimes forgetting where he was or why he was running. In his lucid moments, he thought about Samuel's death and wondered if his friend would have approved of this desperate bid for freedom. He thought about old Moses and the others back at the plantation, probably facing increased scrutiny and punishment because of his escape. Most of all, he thought about Tuhuya's promise to find him in 3 days. Today was the 3rd day. The sound of approaching horses penetrated his fever-addled consciousness like a knife through fog. Multiple riders moving with purpose rather than the random patterns of a patrol. Elijah forced himself to peer through the tangle of dead branches that concealed his hiding place. What he saw made him question whether the fever had finally driven him to hallucination. 5 Comanche warriors sat their horses in a semicircle around his hiding place, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready. At their center rode a man who could only be a war chief, tall, powerfully built, with an aura of command that was unmistakable even to Elijah's untrained eye. Eagle feathers adorned his hair, and his horse was decorated with symbols that spoke of many victories. And beside the war chief, on his painted pony, sat Tuhuya. The boy's eyes swept the area methodically until they fixed on Elijah's hiding place. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, pointing directly at the fallen tree. The war chief's gaze followed, and Elijah felt those dark eyes boring into him with an intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense. There was no point in hiding. Even if he had possessed the strength to run, there was nowhere to go. 5 Comanche warriors on horseback could run down a healthy man in minutes, let alone one weakened by fever and starvation. Slowly, painfully, Elijah crawled out from beneath the tree and stood on unsteady legs. The world tilted dangerously, and he had to grab a branch to keep from falling. The warriors watched him with expressions that revealed nothing, their hands resting casually on their weapons. Tuhuya dismounted and approached him, moving with the fluid grace that seemed natural to his people. Up close, Elijah could see that the boy had been well cared for since their last meeting. His clothes were clean, his face bright with health and purpose. "Elijah," Tuhuya said, his English slightly improved from their previous encounter. "You sick? You hungry?" It wasn't a question. The boy's observant eyes had catalogued Elijah's condition in seconds. Tuhuya reached into his pouch and pulled out a piece of dried meat, the same offering he had made 3 days earlier. This time, Elijah didn't refuse. His hands shook as he accepted the food, and he had to force himself to chew slowly despite the overwhelming urge to devour it. The meat was seasoned with unfamiliar spices, but it was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. As he ate, Tuhuya spoke rapidly to the war chief in their native language. The exchange was animated, with the boy gesturing frequently toward Elijah. The war chief's expression remained impassive, but Elijah caught him studying the scars on Elijah's back, marks left by years of whippings that were visible through his torn shirt. Finally, the war chief spoke, his voice deep and resonant. Tuhuya translated, his young face serious with the weight of interpretation. "Peta Nakona say you save Tuhuya life. This create debt. Comanche always pay debt." Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs. Peta Nakona, he had heard that name whispered around plantation fires. The war chief was a legend on the frontier, known for his tactical brilliance and his fierce resistance to white expansion. To be in his presence was both an honor and a terror. "Tell him," Elijah said carefully, "that I didn't save Tuhuya to create a debt. I saved him because it was the right thing to do." Tuhuya translated, and for the first time, something that might have been surprise flickered across Peta Nakona's features. He spoke again, longer this time, his tone thoughtful. "He say this make debt greater," Tuhuya explained. "You save life with no thought of reward. This is way of true warrior." Peta Nakona asked, "What you need?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire. What did he need? Safety, certainly. Food and medicine for his fever. But as Elijah looked into the faces of these warriors, he realized that his needs had evolved beyond mere survival. "There are others," he said slowly. "Others like me, held against their will. There's a place, a camp where they keep people before selling them south. 50 souls, maybe more, waiting to be shipped to plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi." Tuhuya's translation sparked an immediate reaction among the warriors. They exchanged rapid words, their voices rising with what sounded like anger. Peta Nakona's face darkened, and when he spoke again, his tone was sharp with disgust. "He say white men steal people like they steal land," Tuhuya translated. "This is why Comanche fight. This is why we never surrender." The war chief continued speaking, his words flowing like a river in flood. Tahuya listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification before turning back to Elijah. Peta no Kona say Comanche know this place. Rangers use it to hold captives before trade. We watch but never act because it bring more soldiers. But now, the boy paused, searching for the right words in English. Now, there is reason. Debt must be paid. La. Elijah felt the world shift around him, as if the very ground beneath his feet had moved. What had started as a desperate flight for freedom was becoming something larger, something that could change the fate of dozens of enslaved souls. When? He asked. Peta no Kona smiled for the first time, an expression that was both fierce and oddly gentle. He spoke briefly to Tahuya, who grinned in response. Tonight, the boy said, when moon is dark and guards are lazy. Peta no Kona say you ride with us, if you're strong enough. You know white man ways, you help plan attack. As if summoned by his words, one of the other warriors approached leading a spare horse, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. The message was clear. Elijah Carter, escaped slave and unlikely ally, was being invited to join a Comanche war party. The fever still burned in his veins, and his body screamed with exhaustion, but something deeper than physical strength was stirring in his chest. For the first time since Samuel's death, he felt the spark of hope, not just for his own freedom, but for something greater. I'll ride, he said. As darkness fell over the Texas prairie, Elijah found himself part of something he never could have imagined. A war council where the fate of 50 souls hung in the balance. But what he learned about the enemy they faced would test every assumption about justice, mercy, and the true cost of freedom. The Comanche camp materialized from the prairie like a vision from another world. Hidden in a natural depression between two hills, it was invisible from more than 100 yards away, a masterpiece of tactical positioning that spoke to generations of survival in hostile territory. 15 warriors, their families, and perhaps 30 horses occupied a space that seemed impossibly organized despite its temporary nature. Elijah sat beside a small fire, wrapped in a buffalo robe that one of the warriors had provided. The fever had broken during the afternoon ride, helped by a bitter tea that Tahuya's mother had prepared from prairie herbs. His strength was returning, along with a growing sense of unreality about his situation. 12 hours ago, he had been a dying fugitive hiding under a fallen tree. Now he sat in council with Peta no Kona and his war leaders, planning an assault that would either liberate 50 enslaved souls or get them all killed. Tahuya sat cross-legged beside him, serving as translator for the increasingly complex discussion. The boy's English had improved dramatically over the past few hours, suggesting that his earlier broken speech had been more caution than inability. Peta no Kona wants to know about the guards, Tahuya said. How many men? What weapons? How do they watch the captives? Elijah closed his eyes, calling up memories from his time at the plantation. He had heard the overseers talking about the holding camp, bragging about the profits to be made from processing runaways and selling them to the deep south, where questions weren't asked about ownership papers. 6 guards, maybe 8, he said. They'll have rifles, probably a shotgun or 2. The camp is built around an old trading post, stone walls on 3 sides, wooden stockade on the 4th. The captives are kept in a large pen in the center, probably chained together to prevent escapes. As Tahuya translated, Elijah watched the faces of the warriors around the fire. These were men who had spent their lives fighting for their people's survival, who understood tactics and strategy in ways that went beyond formal military training. Their questions were precise, their planning methodical. What about the Rangers? Asked a scarred warrior whose name Elijah had learned was Iron Hawk. How many soldiers nearby? This was the crucial question, and Elijah wished he had a better answer. I don't know for certain. The camp is supposed to be secret. Officially, it doesn't exist. But there's a ranger station maybe 10 miles south, and they patrol the area regularly. Peter Nakona spoke at length, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions. The other warriors listened intently, occasionally asking questions or offering suggestions. He says the rangers are the real enemy, Tuhuya translated. The guards at the camp are just hired men, probably cowards who run when faced with real fighters. But if rangers come, the battle becomes different, more dangerous. How long would we have? Elijah asked. The question sparked another round of discussion. Maps were drawn in the dirt with sticks, distances calculated, escape routes planned. Elijah found himself impressed by the sophistication of their planning. These were not the savage raiders of frontier legend, but skilled military tacticians. If we strike fast and quiet, maybe 2 hours before rangers arrive, Tuhuya finally reported. Enough time to free captives and escape if everything goes perfect. And if everything doesn't go perfect, Peter Nakona answered this question himself, speaking slowly in English that was heavily accented but clear. Then we die as warriors, fighting for what is right. The simple statement carried a weight that settled over the council like a blanket. These men were prepared to risk everything for people they had never met, simply because it was the honorable thing to do. The contrast with the world Elijah had known, where human beings were bought and sold like cattle, was stark and humbling. As the planning continued, Elijah learned more about his unlikely allies. Ironhawk had lost his entire family to a ranger raid 3 years earlier. Another warrior, called Swift Arrow, had been captured as a child and held in a mission school before escaping back to his people. Each man carried scars, both visible and hidden, from the ongoing war between their culture and the expanding American frontier. But it was Tuhuya's story that affected Elijah most deeply. The boy's father had been killed in a skirmish with Texas Rangers just 2 months earlier, making him an orphan despite his young age. Peter Nakona had taken responsibility for the boy's upbringing, but Comanche culture demanded that even children contribute to the survival of the band. Tuhuya was scouting when you found him, the war chief explained through translation, learning to read the land, to understand the movements of enemies. The quicksand was unfortunate, but your actions saved more than his life. They saved his honor. The weight of that revelation settled on Elijah's shoulders. In saving the boy, he had unknowingly prevented a catastrophe that would have echoed through the entire band. No wonder Peter Nakona felt such a strong obligation to repay the debt. As midnight approached, the final details of the plan took shape. The attack would come in 3 phases. First, a diversionary assault on the main gate to draw the guards' attention. Second, a stealth infiltration through the wooden stockade to reach the captives. Third, a fighting withdrawal that would cover the escape of the freed prisoners. Elijah's role would be crucial, but dangerous. As the only member of the party who could pass for a plantation worker, he would approach the camp openly, claiming to be a runaway seeking shelter. Once inside, he would signal the attack and help coordinate the liberation of the captives. "You understand," Peter Nakona said, his English careful but determined. "If you are discovered before signal, we cannot help you. You will die alone." Elijah nodded. He had understood the risks from the beginning. But as he looked around the circle of warriors, men who were willing to risk everything for strangers, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since Samuel's death. "I understand," he said, "and I'm ready." The council broke up as the warriors began their final preparations. Weapons were checked, horses saddled, and prayers offered to the spirits that watched over warriors in battle. Elijah found himself alone with Tuhuya, who was carefully painting his face with symbols that would protect him in the coming fight. "Are you afraid?" Elijah asked. The boy considered the question seriously before answering. "Fear is good. Fear keeps warrior alive, but fear must not control warrior or he becomes useless." It was wisdom beyond the boy's years, and Elijah realized that Tuhuya had already seen more of life's harsh realities than most adults in the civilized world. The frontier demanded maturity from its children, regardless of their race or culture. As they rode out into the darkness, Elijah carried with him the knowledge that he was no longer fighting just for his own freedom. He was part of something larger, an alliance born of mutual respect and shared humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. The holding camp lay ahead, its walls containing 50 souls who had no idea that salvation was riding toward them through the Texas night. The moment Elijah walked through those camp gates, he knew there was no turning back. But what he discovered inside would force him to make a choice that would haunt him forever. Stay close, because the next few minutes will determine whether 50 souls live free or die in chains. The holding camp squatted against the prairie like a festering wound, its stone walls blackened by years of weather and neglect. Elijah approached on foot, his hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender, playing the role of a desperate runaway seeking sanctuary. Behind him, hidden in the tall grass, Nokona and his warriors waited for the signal that would unleash hell upon this place of human misery. The guard at the gate was a thin man with yellow teeth and the nervous energy of someone who drank too much whiskey to quiet his conscience. His rifle was old, but well-maintained, and his eyes held the calculating look of a man who saw profit in human suffering. "Well, well," the guard drawled, looking Elijah up and down. "What we got here? Another rabbit run to ground?" "Please, sir," Elijah said, affecting the submissive posture he had perfected over years of bondage. "I've been running for days, got nowhere else to go. Heard you might have work for a man willing to earn his keep." The guard laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. "Work? Boy, you got a strange idea of what this place is about, but come on in. Boss'll want to have a look at you." The gate swung open with a rusty screech, and Elijah stepped into a vision of human degradation that made his plantation quarters look like paradise. The central courtyard was dominated by a large wooden pen where dozens of people sat or lay in their own filth, chained together in groups of 6 or 8. Men, women and children, some as young as Tuhuya, stared at him with eyes that had given up hope. The stench hit him like a physical blow. Unwashed bodies, human waste, infection and despair. Several of the captives bore fresh whip marks, and at least 3 appeared to be seriously ill. This wasn't just a holding facility. It was a place where human beings were systematically broken before being sold. "Boss!" the guard called toward a stone building that served as the main quarters. "Got us a fresh one." The man who emerged from the building was everything Elijah had expected, and worse. Thick-set and brutal-looking, with hands that bore the calluses of violence and eyes that held no trace of human compassion. This was Jeremiah Cobb, the camp's overseer, whose reputation for cruelty was whispered about in slave quarters across East Texas. "Where you from, boy?" Cobb asked, circling Elijah like a predator sizing up prey. "Whitmore Plantation, down Fort Bend way," Elijah replied, sticking as close to the truth as possible. "Been running 3 days. Dogs almost got me twice." Cobb nodded approvingly. "Whitmore's a good customer, sends us quality merchandise." "You look strong enough. Probably fetch a good price in New Orleans." He gestured toward the pen. "Get him chained up with the others. We'll add him to tomorrow's shipment." As 2 guards moved to escort him toward the pen, Elijah caught sight of something that made his blood freeze. In the far corner of the courtyard, separated from the main group, sat a small figure that he recognized despite the dirt and bruises that covered her face. Sarah. Little Sarah from the plantation, barely 14 years old, who had disappeared 2 weeks ago during a supply run to town. Everyone had assumed she had drowned crossing a creek, but here she was, alive but broken, her eyes staring at nothing with the vacant look of someone whose spirit had been shattered. The sight of her triggered something primal in Elijah's chest, a rage so pure and focused that it burned away his fear like morning mist before the sun. These men hadn't just stolen freedom. They had stolen innocence, hope, and human dignity. They had taken children and turned them into commodities. As the guards reached for his arms, Elijah made his choice. The plan called for him to wait until he was inside the pen before giving the signal, but Sarah's presence changed everything. He couldn't let her spend another minute in this hell. "Now!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the courtyard like a war cry. The response was immediate and devastating. War cries erupted from the darkness beyond the walls as Peter Nokona's warriors burst from concealment. Arrows whistled through the air with deadly precision, and the guard who had admitted Elijah dropped his rifle and clutched at the shaft protruding from his chest. Cobb spun toward the sound, his hand reaching for the pistol at his belt, but Elijah was already moving. Years of suppressed rage and the memory of Samuel's death fueled his attack as he tackled the overseer, driving him to the ground with bone-jarring force. They rolled in the dirt, fighting for control of Cobb's weapon. The overseer was larger and stronger, but Elijah fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. Around them, the camp erupted into chaos as Comanche warriors poured through the breached gate. Iron Hawk appeared beside the pen, his tomahawk making short work of the chains that bound the captives. "Run!" he shouted in English. "Run to the horses!" But many of the prisoners were too weak or too traumatized to move. Some cowered in terror, unable to distinguish between their liberators and their captors. Others tried to stand, but collapsed from malnutrition and abuse. Elijah finally managed to wrench Cobb's pistol away, but instead of shooting the man, he found himself hesitating. The overseer lay beneath him, blood streaming from his nose, his eyes wide with the terror he had inflicted on so many others. "Please," Cobb gasped, "I got family, I got children." "So did they," Elijah replied, gesturing toward the freed captives. But still he hesitated, the weight of taking a life, even this life, heavy in his hands. The decision was taken from him as Swift Arrow's lance punched through Cobb's chest, ending the overseer's reign of terror in an instant. The warrior looked at Elijah with something that might have been disappointment. "In war, mercy is luxury," Swift Arrow said in broken English. "Luxury we cannot afford." Around them, the battle was winding down. The remaining guards had either fled or fallen, and the Comanche warriors were efficiently gathering the freed captives. But Elijah could hear something that chilled his blood, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. "Rangers!" Tuhuya called from his position on the wall. "Many riders, coming fast!" Peter Nokona's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "We go, now, leave everything!" But as Elijah looked around the courtyard, he realized that many of the captives couldn't travel fast enough to outrun mounted rangers. The children, the sick, the elderly, they would slow the escape and doom everyone. It was then that he made the second crucial decision of the night, one that would echo through the rest of his life. Instead of fleeing with the others, he began helping the weakest captives toward the horses, knowing that each moment he delayed brought the rangers closer. "Elijah!" Peter Nokona called. "We must go!" "Take the ones who can ride," Elijah shouted back. "I'll follow with the rest." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was a lie that would save lives, and sometimes that was the only truth that mattered. As the Comanche warriors disappeared into the darkness with 37 freed souls, Elijah Carter stood in the ruins of the holding camp with 13 people who couldn't escape, waiting for the rangers who would surely kill them all. But in that moment, surrounded by the broken chains and the bodies of their oppressors, he felt more free than he had ever felt in his life. What happened in those final moments before the Rangers arrived would become a legend, whispered in slave quarters across the South. But the true cost of that night's victory was something no one could have predicted. Hold on tight, because this ending will change everything you thought you knew about courage, sacrifice, and the meaning of freedom. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder as Elijah surveyed the 13 souls who remained in the courtyard, too weak, too young, or too broken to escape with Peter Nokona's war party. Among them was Sarah, who had finally recognized him and clung to his arm with desperate strength, her eyes beginning to show the first spark of hope they had held in weeks. "Can you walk?" he asked her gently. She nodded, though her legs shook with the effort of standing. "I can try." Around them, the other survivors were a testament to human endurance, pushed beyond all reasonable limits. An elderly man named Joshua, whose back was a map of whip scars. A pregnant woman called Mary, whose time was near. 3 children, none older than 10, who had been separated from their families and sold like livestock. The sound of the Rangers was close now, perhaps 2 minutes away. Elijah's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in capture or death. The stone walls that had imprisoned these people might now serve as their fortress, but 13 exhausted souls couldn't hold off a ranger patrol for long. It was then that he heard something unexpected, the sound of hoofbeats coming from the opposite direction. For a moment his heart leaped with the hope that Peter Nokona had returned, but the rhythm was wrong. Too many horses moving too fast. From the northern approach came a sight that defied all logic, a column of Union cavalry, their blue uniforms unmistakable even in the moonlight. At their head rode a young officer whose face was grim with purpose, and beside him, incredibly, rode Tuhuya on his painted pony. The boy had somehow found these soldiers and convinced them to follow him back to the camp. But how? And why would Union forces be this far into Texas territory? The answer came as the officer dismounted and approached Elijah with crisp military bearing. "Sergeant Williams, 3rd Iowa Cavalry," he said. "We've been tracking illegal slave trading operations for the War Department. This boy found us and told us about the raid." Elijah stared at Tuhuya, who grinned back with the satisfaction of someone who had just pulled off an impossible feat. "How did you—" "Tuhuya know many things," the boy said proudly. "Know Union soldiers camp by river. Know they hunt bad white men who steal people. Know they help if asked right way." The sound of the approaching Rangers was now unmistakable, and Sergeant Williams quickly assessed the situation. "How many Rangers?" "At least a dozen," Elijah replied. "Maybe more." Williams nodded grimly. "We've got 18 men. Good odds, but this is going to get complicated. These Rangers think they're defending Texas law, and technically, we're operating outside our jurisdiction." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means," Williams said, checking his rifle, "that what happens here tonight never officially happened, but unofficially." He looked around at the freed captives, his jaw set with determination. "Unofficially, we're going to make sure you all get to safety." The Rangers appeared at the camp's entrance like avenging angels, their leader a tall man with captain's bars and the hard eyes of someone who had spent years fighting on the frontier. Captain Morrison was a legend in his own right, a man who had never lost a prisoner and never backed down from a fight. "What in the hell is going on here?" Morrison demanded, taking in the scene of destruction and the mix of freed slaves, Comanche boy, and Union soldiers. "Captain Morrison," Williams replied formally. "Sergeant Williams, 3rd Iowa Cavalry. We're investigating reports of illegal human trafficking in violation of federal law." Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Federal law? Boy, you're in Texas. We make our own laws here. And last I checked, the Union Army had no jurisdiction in this territory." "Actually," Williams said, pulling a document from his jacket, "as of 6 hours ago, Texas is officially part of the United States. The annexation papers were signed in Washington yesterday, which means federal law now applies." The statement hit the assembled Rangers like a physical blow. Several of them exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence shaken by this unexpected development. Morrison himself seemed momentarily stunned, but he quickly recovered. "Even if that's true," he said, "these people are escaped property. They need to be returned to their rightful owners." "No," Elijah said, stepping forward despite the rifles pointed in his direction. "We're not property. We're human beings, and we're free." The confrontation that followed would be remembered differently by everyone who witnessed it. To the Rangers, it was a betrayal of everything they had fought to protect. To the Union soldiers, it was a moment when justice finally prevailed over oppression. To the freed captives, it was the first time in their lives that someone with power had stood up for their humanity. But to Elijah, it was something simpler and more profound. It was the moment when the choice he had made to save Tuhuya's life came full circle, bringing salvation not just to himself, but to dozens of others who had given up hope. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Weapons were drawn on both sides, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. It was Tuhuya who broke the deadlock, riding his pony slowly between the two groups of armed men. "Stop," the boy said, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "Too much death already. Peter Nokona say white men always fight white men. This why Comanches survive. We wait, we watch, we choose right side." He turned to Captain Morrison, speaking with the formal dignity of a tribal diplomat despite his youth. "You hunt escaped slaves, but these people not escape. They were stolen. Stolen from families, stolen from homes, stolen from freedom. Comanche know about stealing. We fight thieves, not victims." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "You little savage, you don't understand." "I understand," Tuhuya interrupted, his eyes flashing. "I understand man who saved my life when he could have let me die. I understand warriors who risk everything for strangers. I understand difference between law and justice." The boy's words hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire. Around the courtyard, the freed captives watched with a mixture of hope and terror, knowing that their fate hung in the balance of this confrontation between two different visions of America. It was then that Sarah stepped forward, her small hand slipping into Elijah's. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible, but somehow carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "I just want to go home." The simple statement shattered something in the tense atmosphere. Several of the Rangers lowered their weapons, their faces troubled. These were men who had families of their own, daughters and sons who might have been Sarah's age. The sight of a brutalized child begging for freedom touched something deeper than politics or law. Captain Morrison looked around at his men, reading the doubt in their faces. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "This ain't over," he said finally. "Texas may be part of the Union now, but that doesn't change what's right and what's wrong." "No," Sergeant Williams agreed quietly, "it doesn't. But maybe it's time we figured out which is which." Indeed, the Rangers withdrew without further violence, but their departure felt more like a postponement than a resolution. The conflict between old ways and new, between state rights and federal authority, between those who saw slavery as natural order and those who saw it as moral abomination, that conflict would continue to simmer until it exploded into civil war 15 years later. But for now, in this moment, 13 souls were free. As dawn broke over the Texas prairie, Elijah found himself saying goodbye to the most unlikely friend he had ever made. Tuhuya sat on his pony, ready to return to his people, but his eyes held a sadness that spoke of bonds formed in crisis and now being severed by necessity. "Will I see you again?" Elijah asked. The boy considered the question with the seriousness he brought to everything. "World is changing," he said finally. "Comanche way ending, white man way beginning. Maybe someday, when change is finished, we meet again as friends instead of strangers." He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small object, a carved piece of bone decorated with symbols that Elijah didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Tuhuya give this to Elijah. It mean brother who saves life. You keep remember that courage makes family where blood cannot." As the boy rode away toward the horizon where his people waited, Elijah clutched the carved bone and felt the weight of everything that had changed in the past week. He was no longer a slave, but he wasn't yet truly free. That would take time, struggle, and the kind of courage that Tahuya had shown in bringing the Union soldiers to their rescue. The freed captives began their journey north, escorted by Sergeant Williams and his men toward a future that was uncertain but filled with possibility. Sarah walked beside Elijah, her hand still in his, her eyes beginning to lose the haunted look that had marked her time in captivity. "What happens now?" she asked, as they crested a hill and looked back at the ruins of the holding camp. "Now we live," Elijah said simply. "We live, and we remember, and we make sure that what happened here means something." Behind them, smoke rose from the burning remains of the camp, a funeral pyre for a system built on human misery. Ahead lay the long road to true freedom, a journey that would take not just miles but generations to complete. But as Elijah Carter walked toward that uncertain future, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories are won not by armies or governments, but by individuals who choose compassion over fear, justice over law, and humanity over hatred. The carved bone in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, a reminder that the bonds forged in crisis could transcend every barrier that society tried to build between people. And somewhere on the vast Texas prairie, a young Comanche warrior carried a similar reminder, proof that courage once shared creates connections that time and distance cannot break. The story of their unlikely alliance would be whispered in slave quarters and Comanche camps for generations to come, a testament to the truth that freedom, once tasted, becomes a hunger that can never be satisfied until it is shared with all who thirst for it. Words, 1599, Epilogue. Echoes across time. 10 years later, as the first shots of the Civil War echoed across America, a weathered man named Elijah Carter would stand before a regiment of Union soldiers, a carved piece of bone in his pocket and a story of impossible friendship on his lips. And in a Comanche camp far to the west, a young war chief named Tahuya would tell his own children about the day a stranger's compassion changed the course of two lives forever. Some bonds, once forged in the crucible of shared humanity, prove stronger than the forces that seek to divide us. This is the story of one such bond, and the 50 souls whose freedom was purchased not with gold, but with the simple recognition that courage, like suffering, knows no boundaries of race or culture. The holding camp was never rebuilt. The land where it stood became a crossroads, where travelers would sometimes pause, sensing something significant in the wind that swept across the prairie grass. And if they listened carefully, they might hear the echo of hoofbeats and war cries, the sound of chains breaking, and the whispered promise that freedom, once shared, multiplies like seeds on the wind.